Keeping our kids away from pornography in the age of the internet. That's the topic of tonight's Byline. Now, it's not often you will hear someone in the media go to bat for pornography. Aside from the fact that it's a sleazy industry with questionable practices, it's also a business that makes over $1 billion a year right here in Canada, and they can likely afford to come to their own defense. However, when the world of adult filmmaking and the world of personal freedom collide, I feel compelled to take up the fight on porno's behalf. Enter British Prime Minister David Cameron. He announced yesterday that the British internet providers will begin blocking access to online pornography unless you, the customer, specifically opt in, thus permitting you to surf the web for explicit material. Now, Cameron wrapped the idea in the all-too-popular notion of the internet being a direct danger to children, and banged the well-worn drum that the sexual images available online were corroding childhood. Now, taken at face value, who could disagree? Every sane, rational human being would do what they could to protect their kids. And if that means making the internet as family-friendly as the wonderful world of Disney, then so be it, right? Wrong. By setting up filters to protect your kids, you are setting up a system that blocks free and unfettered access to a legal online product that 28,000 people around the world, rightly or wrongly, consume every second. On top of that, you are making those consumers feel like they're doing something criminal while having to call up their internet service provider and ask for permission to view pornography. No matter how much of an avid viewer you are, I can only assume that phone call would be embarrassing and may actually put you off making that phone call at all. I don't know about you, but having to explain to my wife that I had the porno turned back on may be a difficult conversation to have around the dinner table. As with any measures that politicians don't fully think through, there are also technical what-if questions that need to be asked. What if I'm researching sexual health? Will that get flagged under the same filter system? Will the word sex be something I can no longer search without permission from Big Brother? These are all valid questions that Mr. Cameron has not been able to provide answers to. Now, Prime Minister Cameron, of course, is not alone. Winnipeg Conservative MP Joyce Smith caught wind of this idea and now says she'll bring it up with Prime Minister Harper. Smith believes that the threat to the kids and what they see on the internet trumps your right to what access you have and what you can enjoy legally online. Last night on my radio show, Smith compared the internet to the old adult film stores with the old beaded curtains where you have to be 18 to even walk in the door. Now, that's a comparison that would hold water if she wasn't missing one glaringly important point. When it comes to kids and the internet, a system of policing already exists, at least in theory. That system is parenting. Unless I've missed something in the last few hours, parents still have the final say as to what their kids do and don't do under the roof of their home. No government intervention needed, just a firm use of the word no would suffice. In fact, every expert I've ever interviewed about children and the internet has said the same thing. If you don't want your kids seeing things or doing things they aren't supposed to online, then the simple answer is to put the computer where you can monitor their activity. Now, that seems like a really simple, thought-out process, doesn't it? Putting the computer in the kitchen or the common area with the screen toward the room, or password protecting the internet so your child can only use it with your permission while you are there, seems like common sense. But these approaches seem to be lost on some of today's parents just as much as they are on government and the government do-gooders that think the heavy hand of censorship is the only option. Now, in no way am I condoning the vile and criminal making of distributing child pornography. That is the moral bar that we've all agreed is wrong, and anybody who ignores that bar should be punished swiftly and severely. However, that's a separate issue from what legal adult pornography you can view in the confines of your own home. The internet is one of the last bastions of freedom out there. As strange as that sounds, it has remained virtually unpoliced by government and those that want to implement their nanny state philosophies on the masses. Part of that freedom is recognizing that there are good and bad elements to the World Wide Web. Some comments you may find distasteful, some images you may not like. But the second you allow government to rein in the internet based on those tastes or those sensibilities is the second that freedom has been dissolved. And that's the Byline.
Children can't go into the shops or the cinema and buy things meant for adults or have adult experiences we rightly regulate to protect them. But when it comes to the internet, in the balance between freedom and responsibility, we've neglected our responsibility to children.
Now, of course, defending pornography is no easy task. This is more about defending freedom of speech. But before I introduce my guest, I want to just show you how many people are actually out there using online pornography. Have a look at this statistic, and you tell me that this isn't something that people are flocking to. Now, imagine those 28,000 users having to call up their internet service provider and beg for permission to turn the porn back on. David Butt is a former Crown prosecutor, and he joins me to talk a little bit about this. David, I understand you've talked a lot about these different kinds of cases. Is David Cameron on the right track?
There's certainly a risk to the strategy he's taking, and I think you've identified some of the key risks. And to me, the biggest risk factor here is the filter. Anytime you have a mechanical filter to try to address something as rich and as nuanced as language, you run into some potentially very serious difficulties, so that the filters can tend to be over-inclusive in what they withhold from people. And if it's over-inclusive, then that's infringing. As you said in your opening, no disagreement with going vigorously after child pornography. The difficulty is sometimes these filters aren't sophisticated enough to differentiate legal and illegal material.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because David Cameron himself did bring up, and he was questioned on it, the Page 3 girl. This is usually a topless magazine or topless newspaper person that appears. It's usually a female that appears, and it's in every daily newspaper across the UK.
Yes.
That would be something that would likely be picked up in a filter like this.
It depends on how the filter parameters are set. But if that's the kind of filtering that they're looking at, then that runs into all kinds of problems. For example, and I totally understand the argument around the objectification of women in a daily newspaper, and there are vocal, vigorous critics making very good arguments on that side of the issue. Sure. The question really, though, is whether you should use a filter to absolutely prohibit it rather than engage in discussion about whether it's right or wrong. And the filter, for example, in other cultures, toplessness is not viewed in the same way, so a lot of innocent and perhaps culturally informative images might be blocked.
Let's talk about what we're trying to prevent here, because this is about kids, and of course I don't want kids to have access to pornography. That's certainly not what I'm fighting for here tonight. I think it's more about adults and having to go through the extra hoops that you have to jump through. Yes. Is this something that is even going to, or should this be the role of government to start protecting kids from these images?
It's something that the government can play a role in, but you have to be very careful about going too far. In other words, one really has to strike a balance, and there's a very good argument that this balance is erring, as you said in your opening, a little bit too far on the side of the nanny state. Is it appropriate to engage in strong discussions with the industry about the delivery of these kinds of materials and the impact on our children? Yes, it's appropriate to have those discussions. Is it appropriate to take the next step and engage in a form of prohibition? That's much more problematic.
You see, I think government sort of counts on the idea that if you mention children and pornography, people automatically think that you're talking about child pornography. In this case, you aren't, but the government, will feed off of the idea that if you mention those words enough, in tandem with one another, you're going to actually have people scared and think that this is all about protecting kids from becoming part of pornography. That's not what we're talking about here.
No, that's right. And we have to realize that there is a spectrum of material from the most vile, degrading child abuse images to the kind of erotica that could find a place in the National Gallery of Canada. So you see a real spectrum of the presentation of human sexuality, and there is a very small subset that is criminal. But we want to be very careful in addressing that small subset that we don't create bigger problems with the whole realm of human expression around human sexuality.
So the real answer is basically to say to the internet providers, listen, if you want to voluntarily put some parameters on or come up with new technologies that will protect kids, great, but don't necessarily say the heavy hand of the government needs to get involved.
I'm not totally averse to there being some kind of government regulation at some point. I don't think we should eliminate any role for government in constructive solutions, but we have to be very careful that the solutions proposed are as nuanced as the problem is. And that's the difficulty with the filter idea.
Do you think government will see that nuance?
We'll have to wait and see. I have some concerns from a technological perspective that the technology is good enough to be an effective filter without being too broad. My concern is technological. Law enforcement is certainly in the process of cataloging a vast array of known child abuse images. And if a filter were limited to those known child abuse images, then we don't have a difficulty. It's just like removing poison from drinking water. We all want that to happen. But when you start going a little bit further, that's where you encounter the problems, and that's where I'm not convinced.
Thank you for the time tonight.
My pleasure.